Israel has hopes all along for deliverance from its own evil, from its own failures. Israel in the Old Testament has a keen sense of its shortcomings from Genesis all the way through to the prophets. And yet the prophets, the Psalms, they look beyond that punishment to a time of restoration, messianic restoration. So what has happened to Israel's judgment and Israel's final restoration? Well, let's just look at how Acts chapter 2 uses some Old Testament texts. This passage in the book of Acts is Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost. And he's interpreting what just happened with the Holy Spirit flooding down on the church and people telling the mighty deeds and the works and the signs and wonders of Jesus Christ. Peter delivers this inspired treatment of Joel's prophecy that after Israel suffers decline, famine, ruin, God will restore it by pouring out His Spirit so that sons and daughters prophesy, its people dream dreams and have visions, and all Israel will be saved. National restoration in Joel, which Israelites, Jews would have just expected to mean, yeah, we'll be great again. We'll be great like David, like we were in David's day. We'll be great like we were in Solomon's day. The good times will roll again. That's what Jews were expecting. That's why they kept getting themselves in trouble. They kept rebelling against Rome or whomever, expecting God would intervene and bring back those glory days, and it never happened that way. It just made things worse every time. Those were frustrated hopes. But in Peter's perspective, and then in the church's perspective, that promise was answered. But it was answered with the ascended Jesus reigning and sending His Holy Spirit to empower His church to be His witnesses to all the ends of the earth. I want you to see that shift. The whole New Testament manifests an awareness of the Spirit's reality and presence and power in what it does. All right? And that is another decisive Christian shift in futurology. The Holy Spirit is like the down payment, the arabon, of the fullness of Jesus' promises. A down payment means you can count on the rest of the transaction to be complete. The Spirit is our guarantee that what God started, God will finish. The most significant literary genre for expressing Christian eschatology is apocalyptic literature. Now, I said earlier that all of the New Testament has an apocalyptic perspective, but apocalyptic explains both a worldview and a kind of literature, a literary genre. The word apocalypsis doesn't mean end of the world catastrophe, December 21st, 2012 or whatever. It just means revelation. It just means unveiling, disclosure. All right? An apocalypse is a big reveal where the curtain's pulled back and you get to see how things really are. And it's as much about the present as about the future. You see apocalyptic literature in the book of Daniel, in Zechariah, in different passages elsewhere. You see it in the apocalyptic passages of the Gospels. You see it, Paul will move into it here and there and move back out of it. And you see it most thoroughly in the book of Revelation. And it uses specific literary devices to do that communicating, really visual, striking, surreal images. It uses earlier images and reprocesses them. So the book of Revelation is a mashup. You know what a mashup is? On YouTube? Rick Astley versus Nirvana, for instance. Revelation is this ginormous mashup that just takes images from all over the Old Testament and resets them and alludes to them. That's why it's very hard to treat it as an encoded thing that needs decoding. It's supposed to be a just crush of images that reminds you of lots of things. It's not supposed to be decoded and pulled apart. And its bottom line is really comfort and assurance and encouragement to persecuted believers who are suffering not in some distant future, but in the present day. Apocalyptic literature emerges when Israel is a minority, persecuted, even at the point of disillusion. That's when apocalyptic is delivered. So in Joel chapter 2, I already talked about how Peter uses that text on Pentecost Day. On that day, the sun will be darkened, the moon turned to blood. This is a way, back in Babylon, in a context where everybody believed astrology, everybody thought the stars were the powers that controlled our lives. Apocalyptic just has God sweeping all the stars out of the sky. You think the stars are the powers? Check this out. Bam, a third of them fall to the earth. Guess who's in charge? Not the stars. The God of Israel's in charge. By the way, obviously apocalyptic isn't literal. If a third of the stars fell to the ground, just ask the physics department what that would mean. Where do you see a transformation like that? Well, I already showed you one on Pentecost Day, but look at another one. There was darkness over the whole land from the 6th hour to the 9th hour. The heavens darkened. That's like a big neon sign above the cross saying, end times. Again and again, those events are pitched onto Jesus' narrative. So that whereas the Old Testament message was that God would deliver Israel through its present trials and all future trials, the bottom line of Christian apocalyptic is that Jesus will deliver his church through its present trials and all future trials. It's really the same message, just centered now in the kingdom of Jesus Christ. It's not some encoded text that won't make any sense until the 25th century when all the events line up and everything suddenly makes sense. Revelation makes sense as a first century text about first century events in the Roman Empire. In fact, it makes more sense of those events than any subsequent century. It transforms the hopes and the images of Old Testament apocalyptic by resetting them in Jesus' context. Israel expects, especially as its enemies grow in power and it gets weaker and weaker, its apocalyptic prophets expect someday a final deliverance from its enemies, a final judgment of the whole world and all of the world's evil, and a final salvation for Israel. Daniel chapter 7 speaks to that. Israel's facing these imperial threats. The Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks, later the Romans. What's going to happen to this poor people stuck in this horrible place to be if you're trying to be a sovereign state because you're on the frontier of all these other empires? What's going to happen to us? And Daniel expects this decisive judgment. I looked then because of the sound of the great words which the horn was speaking, and as I looked, the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. And as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. And I saw visions in the night, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and kingdom, and all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. These are the words that Jesus appeals to when they ask him at trial, "Are you the Messiah?" And he says, "You've said so, and you'll see the Son of Man coming in glory. And they say, time's up, dude. That's blasphemy to call yourself this divine judge. But look at it also in Revelation chapter 1. Look at what Revelation has done with this image. Starting with verse 7. Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, everyone who has pierced him. All the tribes of the earth will wail on account of him. That's Jesus he's referring to. I, John, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day on the island of Patmos. I'm paraphrasing. And I heard a loud voice saying, write what you see. And then, now in verse 12, I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me. And on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. Those are churches. And in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden girdle around his breast, and his eyes and his hair were white as white wool, white as snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. So this is Daniel imagery that you would recognize, right? Peanuts and Cracker Jack. You're like, oh, I'm seeing the one who's going to deliver all things, who's going to deliver Israel from these empires all around, who's finally going to free our people from all those Gentiles. Down at 17, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead, but he laid his right hand upon me, saying, fear not, I am the first and the last, and the living one. I died, and behold, I'm alive forever, and I have the keys to death and the grave. This prophecy places Daniel's hopes firmly on Jesus alone. And this hope for ethnic Israel to be free from imperial domination has turned into what is the reign of the Lamb over all nations, but not just for Israel's benefit. Though his worshipers aren't just Israelites, now they're from every tribe and tongue and nation. That's where we're going next with the doctrine of the church. The doctrine of the church is a function of Christian eschatology. The church is what God is doing at this time between Jesus' ascension and his return. See, Israel was looking forward to the glory days of David and Solomon when it could kick the Philistines around the block, when it was wealthy and powerful and mighty in worldly terms. And it doesn't get that. And that disappointment carries on to this day.